The morning mist clung to the grounds of Kensington Palace like a protective shroud, but Detective Inspector James Morrison felt no protection from the weight pressing down on his chest. 6 months ago, he had been a decorated police officer with commendations for bravery and an unblemished record. Today, he stood in the shadow of royalty, wearing the crisp uniform of the Royal Protection Squad, tasked with guarding the most precious members of the British royal family. The assignment had seemed like a dream promotion when it first came through official channels. James had earned his place through years of exemplary service, countless hours of training, and psychological evaluations that deemed him suitable for the highest levels of security clearance. What the evaluations had not prepared him for was the reality of protecting a 7-year-old princess who had not spoken a single word in public since a traumatic incident that had shaken the entire kingdom 6 months prior. Princess Charlotte had been returning from a charity visit to a children's hospital when their convoy was attacked by a lone gunman with mental health issues. The bullets had shattered the reinforced glass of her vehicle, sending fragments across the back seat where she sat with her governess. Though physically unharmed, the young princess had retreated into complete silence, refusing to speak even to her parents, Prince William and Catherine. The incident had been kept largely quiet by the palace press office, but whispers of concern echoed through the corridors of power. James adjusted his earpiece as he took his position outside the private quarters where Princess Charlotte spent most of her days. Through the tall windows, he could see her sitting in the morning room, staring out at the gardens with an expression far too serious for someone so young. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a pale blue dress that made her seem even smaller against the ornate furniture surrounding her. She had been drawing in a sketchbook, but now the pencil lay forgotten beside her as she gazed at something only she could see. The silence that surrounded the princess had become a source of growing concern for everyone in the palace. Medical examinations had revealed no physical damage to her vocal cords or hearing. Child psychologists had attempted various approaches to encourage communication, but Charlotte remained locked in her own world, responding only with nods, shakes of her head, or the occasional hand gesture when absolutely necessary. James had been briefed extensively about the princess's condition before taking on his assignment. He understood that his role extended beyond physical protection. He was to be a constant, reassuring presence in her daily life. What he had not expected was how deeply her silence would affect him personally. Having grown up in a working-class family in Manchester, James had never imagined he would find himself developing such genuine care for a member of the royal family. During his first weeks on the assignment, James had maintained the professional distance expected of royal protection officers. He spoke only when necessary, remained alert to potential threats, and followed protocols established over decades of royal security experience. But, as days turned into weeks, he began to notice small details about the young princess that others seemed to miss. Charlotte had developed a habit of leaving small drawings scattered around the palace. James would find them tucked between books in the library, placed carefully on windowsills, or left on chairs in various rooms. The drawings were always signed with a simple C in the corner, and they depicted scenes of remarkable detail and emotion for someone so young. Some showed gardens filled with impossible flowers, others featured animals engaged in human activities, and a few portrayed scenes that seemed to come from fairy tales or dreams. One particular drawing had caught James's attention several weeks earlier. It showed a figure in a dark uniform standing beside a smaller figure in a blue dress. Both figures were surrounded by what appeared to be a protective bubble, with threatening shadows kept at bay around the edges. When James had discovered this drawing on his chair in the security office, he had studied it for long minutes, wondering if the princess had somehow been observing him as much as he had been watching over her. The palace staff had grown accustomed to working around Charlotte's silence, developing an intricate system of nonverbal communication to meet her needs. Her governess, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartwell, had become particularly skilled at reading the subtle changes in the princess's expressions and body language. The kitchen staff knew to prepare her favorite foods without being asked, and the housekeeping team had learned to work quietly around her preferred spaces. But James had begun to notice something that others seemed to miss entirely. When Charlotte thought no one was watching, she would mouth words silently to herself. He had caught glimpses of her lips moving as she sat by windows or walked through the gardens. She was not truly silent, she was choosing silence as a form of protection from a world that had suddenly become dangerous and unpredictable. This realization had come to James during a particularly quiet afternoon 3 weeks into his assignment. Charlotte had been sitting in the conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and filtered sunlight, when she had picked up one of her drawing pencils and begun to write something in her sketchbook. From his position near the doorway, James could not see the words clearly, but he could observe her lips moving as she formed each letter. She was not just drawing, she was writing out conversations, perhaps with imaginary friends or maybe with the family members she could no longer bear to speak to directly. The weight of this discovery had settled heavily on James's shoulders. Here was a child trapped not by physical barriers but by emotional ones so profound that she had essentially built walls around her own voice. As someone whose job was to protect her from external threats, James found himself wondering who would protect her from the internal ones that seemed far more dangerous. His training had prepared him for many scenarios: armed attackers, suspicious packages, crowd control during public appearances, and emergency evacuations. But nothing in his extensive preparation had equipped him to handle the sight of a 7-year-old princess struggling with trauma that manifested as selective mutism. The irony was not lost on him that he, whose voice was trained to bark commands and coordinate security responses, was tasked with protecting someone who had chosen to give up her voice entirely. The palace had tried various approaches to encourage Charlotte to speak again. Child psychologists had used play therapy, art therapy, and even music therapy in attempts to break through her silence. Voice coaches had been brought in to ensure that when she was ready to speak, her vocal cords would be properly prepared. Specialists in childhood trauma had evaluated her case and recommended patience above all else, warning that forcing communication could potentially cause even deeper psychological damage. James had observed these sessions from a respectful distance, noting how Charlotte would participate in activities but always stop short of actual verbal communication. She would nod enthusiastically during music sessions, smile at jokes told by her therapists, and even laugh silently at particularly amusing moments. But words remained locked away, as if she had hidden the key somewhere even she could not find it. The media attention surrounding Charlotte's condition had been carefully managed by the palace press office. Official statements spoke of the princess taking a temporary break from public appearances while recovering from a minor incident. The truth about her silence was known only to immediate family members, key palace staff, and the small team of security professionals assigned to her protection. James understood the delicate nature of this information and the trust that had been placed in him to maintain absolute discretion. What troubled James most deeply was not the silence itself, but the profound sadness he sometimes glimpsed in Charlotte's eyes when she thought no one was looking. During quiet moments, when she sat alone with her thoughts, her young face would take on an expression of loss that seemed far too mature for her age. It was as if the attack had not only stolen her voice but also her childhood sense of safety and wonder. The palace gardens had become Charlotte's favorite refuge during these difficult months. James would escort her on daily walks through the carefully maintained grounds, watching as she moved among the flower beds and fountains with a grace that belied her young age. She seemed to find peace among the roses and lavender, often stopping to touch petals gently or to watch butterflies as they moved from bloom to bloom. During these garden walks, James had occasionally seen her lips move as if she were speaking to the flowers themselves, sharing secrets that she could not yet trust to human ears. As autumn approached and the leaves began to change color, James noticed a subtle shift in Charlotte's behavior. She had begun to spend more time writing in her various notebooks and sketchbooks, filling page after page with words and images that she kept carefully hidden from adult eyes. Her drawings had become more complex and detailed, often featuring scenes of transformation, caterpillars becoming butterflies, seeds growing into towering trees, and small figures emerging from shadows into sunlight. The palace staff had grown genuinely fond of the young princess during her months of silence. Despite her inability to speak, Charlotte possessed a natural warmth and kindness that endeared her to everyone she encountered. She would leave small gifts for staff members, a flower picked from the garden for a housekeeper, a drawing for someone who had been particularly kind, or simply a gentle touch on the arm to acknowledge their presence. These gestures spoke louder than words ever could, revealing a depth of compassion and awareness that impressed even the most experienced palace employees. James found himself looking forward to his shifts more than he had ever expected. The quiet companionship he shared with Charlotte had become oddly comforting. Unlike his previous assignments in law enforcement, where communication was constant and often urgent, this role required him to develop new skills in observation and nonverbal awareness. He had learned to read the subtle changes in Charlotte's posture that indicated fatigue, the slight tilt of her head that meant she wanted to move to a different location, and the way her hands moved when she was feeling particularly anxious or unsettled. But, beneath the professional satisfaction, James carried a growing sense of helplessness. Each day that passed without Charlotte speaking felt like another small defeat, another sign that whatever damage had been done during the attack was proving more resilient than anyone had hoped. The medical experts remained optimistic, insisting that children were remarkably resilient and that patience was the key to eventual recovery. Yet James could not shake the feeling that time was working against them, that each silent day made it easier for Charlotte to retreat further into her protective shell. The approaching Christmas season had brought additional challenges to the palace routine. Traditionally, the royal children would participate in various holiday celebrations and public appearances. The question of how to handle Charlotte's continued silence during these events had become a source of considerable discussion among palace officials. Some suggested that she should maintain her regular schedule with minimal adjustments, while others recommended a complete withdrawal from public life until her voice returned. Princess Catherine had been particularly affected by her daughter's silence. James had observed the Duchess during family moments, noting the careful way she spoke to Charlotte and the patient manner in which she waited for nonverbal responses. There were times when he saw the strain in Catherine's eyes.